You think you know what a party is, don't you? Instagram stories, champagne bubbles, maybe someone puking in a corner at 3 a.m. Cute, adorable even. But tonight, while you scroll through your sanitized social media feed, I'm going to tell you about parties that would make your worst nightmares look like a children's birthday celebration. Welcome to the Renaissance, where the nobility didn't just party. They practiced an art form of human degradation that would make modern dictators weep with envy. Picture this: Florence, 1495. The Medici palace glows with candlelight, silk tapestries catching shadows that dance like demons on marble walls, the air thick with incense and something else, something metallic. You smell it before you see it. Blood. Not from violence, mind you. Not yet. From the entertainment. Human chess pieces bleeding real blood while nobles sip wine and place bets on which pawn dies first. And you thought your office Christmas party was uncomfortable. The invitation arrives, on parchment so fine it feels like human skin, because sometimes it was. The Borgia family had a particular fondness for using executed prisoners' skin for their most exclusive invitations. Pope Alexander VI himself would run his fingers over these macabre announcements, feeling the texture of what used to be someone's back, someone's chest. The ink was often mixed with actual blood, virgin's blood for the most special occasions, though any peasants would do for routine gatherings. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just parties, they were laboratories. Laboratories for testing the limits of human endurance, human dignity, human sanity. The Renaissance nobility had discovered something that modern psychology would later confirm. Absolute power doesn't corrupt absolutely. It reveals what was always there, lurking beneath the surface of civilized behavior like maggots in a beautiful corpse. Take the infamous parties of Cardinal Giovanni de' Medici, later Pope Leo X. His gatherings weren't mere social events, they were theater. Elaborate performances, where the line between audience and performer, between human and animal, between sacred and profane, dissolved like sugar and poison. Guests would arrive expecting dinner and wine. They'd leave questioning their own humanity, if they left at all. The entertainment began innocently enough. Jesters, musicians, dancers, the usual medieval fare. But as the night progressed and the wine flowed, the true show began. Dwarfs were dressed as angels and suspended from the ceiling with actual hooks through their flesh, their screams harmonizing with the chamber music. Nobles would bet on how long they could sing before passing out from blood loss. The winner got to choose the next angel from the serving staff. But wait, there's more. The dinner itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Courses were served on living tables. Naked peasants who had been drugged into paralysis, their bodies painted and decorated like furniture. Nobles would eat directly off human backs, using fingers to trace patterns in the body paint, while the living tables tried not to scream. The drug they used, a mixture of belladonna and opium, kept the victims conscious but unable to move. They could feel everything. Your modern parties have nothing on the creativity of Renaissance cruelty. The Sforza family in Milan perfected the art of the living sculpture. Guests who were slowly encased in wax while still alive, their screams muffled as the hot wax filled their mouths and nostrils. The process took hours, and the partially encased victims would be displayed throughout the palace as decorations. Some were kept alive for days, their eyes the only things moving as nobles used them as conversation pieces. The Duke of Ferrara, Alfonso d'Este, took a different approach. His parties featured human hunting. Peasants were released into the palace gardens and hunted like animals by nobles on horseback. The twist? The peasants were given wooden swords and told that anyone who survived until dawn would be granted freedom. None ever did. The gardens were designed as a maze with no exit, and the nobles knew every dead end, every false path. The screams echoing through the hedges were music to their ears. And the women? Oh, the noble ladies were far from innocent observers. They pioneered techniques that would make modern torturers blush. The Duchess of Urbino, Elisabetta Gonzaga, hosted beauty contests where peasant women were slowly flayed alive to see whose skin would make the finest gloves. The judging criteria included not just the quality of the skin, but how melodiously the victims could sing while being skinned. The winner's family received a gold coin. The winner received death. But here's what really happened at these parties. What the history books don't tell you. They were networking events. Political alliances were forged over the screams of the dying. Trade agreements were signed in blood that wasn't always ink. Marriages were arranged while watching children fight to the death. The Renaissance nobility understood something that modern society has forgotten. Shared atrocity creates unbreakable bonds. The Vatican itself hosted parties that would make Caligula proud. Pope Alexander II's infamous Banquet of Chestnuts in 1501 wasn't just about naked prostitutes dancing around chestnuts. It was about power, about showing visiting dignitaries that the church could command such depravity that earthly rulers would seem tame by comparison. Cardinals would compete to see who could force the most chestnuts into a screaming victim's mouth before they suffocated. The winner received a special blessing from the Pope himself. These weren't isolated incidents. They were a system, a culture, a way of life that lasted for centuries, hidden behind the facade of Renaissance humanism and artistic achievement. While Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel, the very people who commissioned it were hosting parties where humans were used as paintbrushes. their blood creating abstract masterpieces on canvas made from stretched human skin. The technology of torment advanced with each gathering. The Medici developed new drugs that would keep victims conscious for days while their bodies were systematically destroyed. The Borgias perfected poisons that would cause specific types of agony, some that would make victims laugh uncontrollably while their organs shut down, others that would cause hallucinations so vivid that victims would beg for death while seeing their loved ones' faces melting. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the cruelty itself, it was the bureaucracy of it all. These parties required planning, logistics, supply chains. There were official positions: master of screams, keeper of flesh, curator of suffering. There were budgets, schedules, rotation systems for the victims. The Renaissance nobility had industrialized human suffering centuries before the Industrial Revolution. And the guests? They didn't just attend, they participated. Ambassadors from across Europe would compete in games that involved slowly driving nails through children's hands while maintaining diplomatic conversation. The ability to negotiate treaties while casually torturing innocents was considered a mark of sophisticated statecraft. Your modern politicians are amateurs compared to these masters of duplicity. The children of nobility grew up in this environment. They learned to walk by stepping on crawling peasants. They learned to speak by mimicking the screams of the dying. They learned mathematics by counting how many cuts it took to make someone beg for mercy. This wasn't considered abnormal, it was education. Preparation for leadership in a world where power meant the ability to inflict suffering without consequence. But these parties weren't just about individual cruelty. They were about maintaining social order through terror. When word spread through the peasant communities about what happened at noble gatherings, rebellion became unthinkable. Why revolt when you knew that capture meant becoming entertainment at the next party? The Renaissance nobility had discovered that the most effective government isn't one that kills its enemies. It's one that makes them wish they had never been born. The record-keeping was meticulous. The Medici archives contained detailed accounts of every party, every victim, every method of torment. They cataloged suffering like modern businesses catalog inventory. There were performance reviews for torturers, efficiency ratings for different methods of inflicting pain, cost-benefit analyses of various entertainment options. The banality of evil, centuries before Hannah Arendt gave it a name. But here's the truth that will keep you awake tonight. These weren't monsters. They were people. People with families, with hopes, with fears. People who prayed to the same God you might pray to, who loved their children, who cried at funerals. They were human beings who had simply been given permission to express the darkest aspects of human nature without consequences. And when humans are given that permission, this is what happens. The Renaissance ended, but the parties never really stopped. They just moved underground, evolved, adapted. The same impulses that drove those noble gatherings exist today, bubbling beneath the surface of civilized society, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The technology has changed, the methods have evolved, but the fundamental truth remains. Given enough power and enough permission, humans will always find new ways to celebrate the suffering of others. So next time you're at a party, sipping your wine and making small talk, remember the Renaissance nobility. Remember what parties can become when power meets opportunity, when wealth meets cruelty, when civilization meets its own shadow. Remember that every smile can hide a scream, every toast can celebrate a torment, every gathering can become a gateway to hell on earth. But that's just the beginning. The real horror isn't what happened at these parties, it's what they reveal about human nature itself. And next time, I'll tell you about the specific rituals, the ceremonies that turned these gatherings from simple cruelty into something far more sinister. Organized religion of suffering, complete with its own priests, its own sacraments, its own twisted form of communion with the divine. Because the Renaissance nobility didn't just torture people for fun, they believed they were serving a higher purpose. They thought they were touching the face of God through the screams of the innocent. And the terrifying truth is, they might have been right. You still think this is about sadistic entertainment, don't you? That these were just rich psychopaths amusing themselves with peasant blood? Sweet summer child, you understand nothing. What I'm about to tell you will shatter your comfortable assumptions about the Renaissance, about religion, about the very nature of power itself. These weren't parties. They were sacraments. Holy communion with forces that predate Christianity, that lurk in the shadows of every cathedral, that whisper through the prayers of every saint. The year was 1503, Rome. The Sistine Chapel had just been completed, Michelangelo's brushstroke still wet with divine inspiration. But in the basement of the Vatican, Cardinal Cesare Borgia was preparing for a different kind of religious experience. The altar wasn't made of marble. It was made of living flesh. 12 peasant children, drugged into paralysis but fully conscious, arranged in the shape of a cross. Their bodies had been painted with symbols that predated Christ by millennia. Sumerian, Egyptian, Babylonian. The old gods were hungry, and the Renaissance church knew exactly how to feed them. The ceremony began at midnight, not because of any Christian tradition, but because that's when the barriers between worlds grow thin. The attending cardinals, dressed in robes that weren't quite the right color, black instead of scarlet, with embroidered symbols that would make archaeologists weep, formed a circle around the human altar. They chanted in languages that officially didn't exist, languages that had been preserved in the Vatican's secret archives, in books bound with human skin and written in blood that never dried. But here's where your modern mind will break. This wasn't devil worship. This was older than devils. The Renaissance nobility had discovered something that modern psychology would call the observer effect, the idea that consciousness itself shapes reality, but they had learned to weaponize it. They believed that by witnessing supreme suffering, by orchestrating perfect agony, they could literally reshape the fabric of existence itself. And based on their success in dominating Europe for centuries, they might have been onto something. The Medici family perfected what they called the flesh sacrament. Lorenzo de' Medici, the patron of arts and learning, would host gatherings where living humans were slowly transformed into artistic masterpieces. Not metaphorically, literally, using techniques that combined surgery, chemistry, and what we would now call psychological programming. Victims were kept alive, while their bodies were systematically modified into living sculpture. The process took weeks. The screams were considered music. The agony was considered prayer. The transformation wasn't random. Each victim was chosen for specific qualities: voice, bone structure, spiritual purity. They were measured, cataloged, studied like specimens. The Medici had developed a science of suffering, complete with charts showing how different types of pain affected different personality types. They knew that artistic souls screamed in harmonious thirds. They knew that the religiously devout would call out to God in specific patterns. They knew that children's cries could shatter glass at precisely the right frequency. And the church? The church was their greatest customer. Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, commissioned special ceremonies for his military victories. These weren't Thanksgiving masses. They were feeding rituals. Captured enemy soldiers were brought to secret chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica, where they were slowly dismembered while papal scribes recorded every word they spoke. The Vatican believed that the last words of the dying contained prophetic power. They were building a library of final breaths, a collection of death songs that would guide papal policy for centuries. The process was industrial in its precision. There were specialists for everything: pain artists who knew exactly how to keep victims conscious for maximum duration, flesh architects who could modify human bodies into impossible shapes while maintaining life, sound harvesters who collected screams and classified them by pitch, duration, and spiritual content. The Renaissance nobility had created the economy of agony, with suffering as the ultimate currency. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the cruelty, it was the results. These ceremonies actually worked. Families who participated in these rituals saw their wealth multiply impossibly. Their political enemies died in convenient accidents. Their military campaigns succeeded against impossible odds. The Borgia Pope's son, Cesare, conquered most of Italy using armies that seemed supernaturally effective. Coincidence? The Renaissance nobility didn't think so. The rituals became more elaborate as their success grew. The Sforza family in Milan created the Cathedral of Screams, a specially designed chamber where the acoustics amplified suffering to such a degree that participants claimed to hear the voice of God himself speaking through the agony. The walls were lined with living prisoners, their mouths forced open, their vocal cords modified to produce specific tones when they breathed. The chamber became a human organ, played by torture, conducted by nobility who genuinely believed they were creating divine music. The Gonzaga family in Mantua took a different approach. They discovered that children's terror could be concentrated and preserved. Using techniques that combined medieval alchemy with proto-psychology, they developed methods for extracting pure fear from young victims and storing it in specially prepared vessels. These terror chalices were then used in ceremonies designed to intimidate enemies, break sieges, and ensure political loyalty. The fear wasn't just psychological, it was treated as a physical substance that could be weaponized. And the women? The noble ladies weren't passive observers, they were the high priestesses of this new religion of suffering. Isabella d'Este, the First Lady of the Renaissance, hosted gatherings where female victims were slowly transformed into living tapestries. Their skin was tattooed with moving images, not static tattoos, but pictures that actually moved as the victim's muscles contracted in agony. The process required keeping the victims alive for months, while their entire bodies were converted into animated artwork. The techniques were passed down through generations like family recipes. Noble children learned to calculate the precise amount of pain needed to achieve specific spiritual effects. They studied anatomy not to heal, but to maximize suffering. They learned languages not to communicate, but to understand the prayers of victims from different cultures. The Renaissance nobility had created universities of agony, complete with examinations, degrees, and advanced research in applied cruelty. But here's the part that will make you question everything you think you know about progress, about civilization, about human nature itself. These practices didn't end with the Renaissance. They evolved. They adapted. They went underground. The same families who pioneered these techniques in the 15th century continued to practice them in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries and beyond. The methods became more sophisticated, the targets more carefully selected, the results more subtle but no less effective. The French Revolution? Many of the executed nobles were practitioners of these ancient arts. The American Revolution? Several of the founding fathers had witnessed ceremonies that would make your nightmares seem like pleasant dreams. The Industrial Revolution, the factories weren't just producing goods, they were producing suffering on an industrial scale, and the profits were being channeled into rituals that would make the Renaissance nobility weep with envy. The truth is that these families never went away. They just learned to hide better. They adapted their techniques to modern times, using psychology instead of physical torture, using media instead of chambers, using economics instead of armies. The same impulses that drove those Renaissance ceremonies are still at work today, just with better public relations and more sophisticated methods. Look around you. Look at the wealth inequality. Look at the systematic exploitation. Look at the way suffering is monetized, packaged, and sold as entertainment. Look at how the powerful feed on the agony of the powerless. The Renaissance nobility didn't disappear. They evolved. They learned to feed more efficiently, to cause suffering more subtly, to harvest agony without leaving physical marks. The ceremonies still happen. The locations have changed. Private islands instead of palace basements, corporate boardrooms instead of cathedral chambers, digital networks instead of physical gatherings. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Power is sustained through the careful cultivation and consumption of human suffering. The Renaissance nobility discovered this truth centuries ago, and their descendants have been perfecting it ever since. So next time you see a billionaire's yacht, a politician's mansion, a corporate executive's private jet, remember the Renaissance nobility. Remember that extreme wealth has always required extreme sacrifice, not from the wealthy, but from everyone else. Remember that every fortune has been built on carefully orchestrated suffering, every empire sustained by the systematic consumption of human agony. The Renaissance never ended. It just learned to wear a suit and tie. The parties still happen. The ceremonies still continue. The same old gods still hunger for the same old offerings. And the same families who learned to feed them 5 centuries ago are still at the table, still cutting deals, still harvesting what they need to maintain their power. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what these ceremonies revealed about the nature of suffering itself, about why it exists, about what purpose it serves in the grand design of reality, and about who, or what is really in charge of this world we think we understand. Next time, I'll tell you about the visitors, the ones who came to these ceremonies not as participants, but as observers, the ones who weren't quite human, who offered knowledge in exchange for entertainment, who taught the Renaissance nobility techniques that shouldn't exist in any natural world, because the real horror isn't what humans did to each other in those palace basements, it's what was watching, what was learning, what was pleased. Venice, 1507, the Doge's palace, after midnight. If you had been there, creeping through those marble corridors, you would have noticed something wrong with the shadows. They moved independently of their sources. They whispered in languages that predated human speech. They had eyes that reflected light that wasn't there. The Renaissance nobility called them the Watchers, and they had been attending these ceremonies since the very first scream echoed through the very first palace basement. But let me tell you what really happened when Doge Leonardo Loredan hosted his most infamous gathering. The guest list included 23 of Europe's most powerful nobles, 12 high-ranking church officials, and 3 visitors who had no names, no origins, and no reflections in the polished silver mirrors that lined the ceremonial chamber. These weren't demons. Demons would have been too simple, too explainable. These were something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between human understanding and cosmic horror. The ceremony began with the usual brutality. Peasant children arranged in geometric patterns, their screams calibrated to specific frequencies, their blood collected in vessels that seemed to absorb more liquid than their size should allow. But as the night progressed, something changed. The air grew thick with a presence that made even the most hardened torturers pause. The candles flickered not from wind, but from breathing that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when they appeared. Not walking through doors, but emerging from the spaces between seconds, materializing from the gaps in reality itself. They were tall, impossibly tall, with proportions that hurt to look at directly. Their faces were human enough to be recognizable, alien enough to be terrifying. They wore robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of space itself, patterns that shifted and moved like living things, colors that had no names in any human language. The Watchers didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone conveyed knowledge that bypassed language entirely, downloading information directly into the minds of those present. The Renaissance nobility learned techniques that night that would make their previous cruelties look like children's games. They learned how to extend life indefinitely while maximizing suffering. They learned how to harvest not just screams but souls themselves. They learned how to use human agony as a power source for technologies that wouldn't be invented for centuries. But the most disturbing revelation was this. The Watchers weren't interested in the torture itself. They were interested in the Watchers. They were studying human reactions to extreme suffering, cataloging the responses, mapping the psychological territory of cruelty. The Renaissance nobility thought they were the predators, but they were actually the experiment. The Watchers were conducting research, and human beings, both victims and perpetrators, were the test subjects. The records, hidden in the deepest vaults of the Vatican secret archives, describe transactions that defy explanation. The Watchers offered knowledge in exchange for what they called resonance experiences, moments when human consciousness touched something beyond normal reality through the medium of perfectly orchestrated agony. They provided detailed instructions for creating these experiences, complete with architectural plans for chambers that amplified suffering, chemical formulas for drugs that enhanced pain while preventing death, and psychological techniques for breaking human minds in specific, measurable ways. Pope Julius II himself met with the Watchers in 1508 in a ceremony held beneath the altar of St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope's private journal, written in a code that wasn't broken until 1823, describes entities that spoke without words, moved without walking, and promised knowledge that would make the Church master of all earthly kingdoms. The price? The Pope agreed to modify certain church rituals, adding elements that would generate the spiritual resonance the Watchers required. The changes were subtle but profound. Confession became a tool for identifying ideal victims. Communion was modified to include substances that increased sensitivity to pain. The structure of the Mass itself was altered to create psychological states that made observers more susceptible to the Watchers' influence. Millions of Christians unknowingly participated in ceremonies designed to feed entities that existed beyond human consciousness. The Medici family's relationship with the Watchers was even more intimate. Lorenzo de' Medici's son, Pope Leo X, hosted regular audiences with beings that his advisors described as angels of a different heaven. These weren't the beautiful, comforting angels of Christian tradition. These were entities of pure intellect, utterly alien in their morality, completely indifferent to human suffering, except as a source of fascinating data. The techniques they taught were revolutionary. The Medici learned to create pain symphonies on elaborate tortures that generated specific emotional and spiritual frequencies. They learned to build suffering engines, mechanical devices that could torture dozens of victims simultaneously while measuring and recording their responses. They learned to breed victims with specific genetic traits that made their agony more useful for the Watchers' purposes. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. The Watchers weren't just observers, they were farmers. They had been cultivating human civilization for millennia, guiding its development in directions that would maximize the production of the specific types of suffering they required. The Renaissance wasn't a flowering of human creativity, it was a harvest season. The art, the literature, the scientific discoveries were all byproducts of a society that had been optimized for generating the particular forms of consciousness that the Watchers found useful. The nobles who participated in these ceremonies began to change, not just psychologically, but physically. Their lifespans extended far beyond normal human limits, so their mental capabilities increased dramatically. Their political instincts became supernaturally acute. But the price was their humanity itself. They became something else, something that wore human faces but thought with alien minds. The Sforza family's archives contain detailed anatomical drawings of these transformations. Noble participants grew additional organs, not visible from the outside, but detectable through careful examination. These new organs seemed to serve as receivers for the Watchers' transmissions, allowing direct communication with entities that existed outside normal space-time. The nobles became living antennae, broadcasting human suffering to audiences that spanned dimensions. The ceremonies became more elaborate as this relationship deepened. The Watchers provided blueprints for architectural marvels that shouldn't have been possible with Renaissance technology. The Palazzo Ducale in Venice contains chambers that are larger on the inside than the outside. The Medici Palace in Florence has rooms that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. St. Peter's Basilica was built with acoustic properties that can transmit sounds to listeners in other realities. These architectural impossibilities served as performance spaces for increasingly sophisticated ceremonies. The Watchers taught the nobility to create reality storms, localized distortions of space-time generated by perfectly orchestrated suffering. These storms allowed communication with entities from other dimensions, other timelines, other versions of reality where human history had unfolded differently. The most successful ceremonies opened portals to parallel worlds where humanity had developed along different evolutionary paths. The Renaissance nobility learned to harvest resources from these alternate realities, not just material wealth, but knowledge, technology, and forms of consciousness that had never existed in our timeline. They became interdimensional traders, with human suffering as their primary export. But the Watchers weren't the only entities interested in these ceremonies. As the portals opened wider, other things began to take notice. Things that made the Watchers look benevolent by comparison. Things that didn't just want to study human suffering, they wanted to reshape reality itself using human consciousness as raw material. The records describe visitors that defied all attempts at classification, beings made of living mathematics, entities that existed as pure information, creatures that fed on possibility itself, devouring potential futures, and leaving only the darkest timelines intact. The Renaissance nobility had opened a door that they couldn't close, and things were coming through that had been waiting for eons for exactly this opportunity. The political implications were staggering. Wars weren't fought just for territory or resources. They were fought to generate the specific types of mass suffering that would attract favorable attention from entities that could guarantee victory. The 100 Years' War, the Italian Wars, the Ottoman invasions, all of these conflicts were secretly orchestrated to create the conditions necessary for large-scale ceremonies that would reshape the balance of power between dimensions. The Church's role in this cosmic conspiracy was more complex than simple evil. Many Church officials genuinely believed they were fighting for humanity's soul, but they were fighting against enemies that existed beyond their comprehension, using weapons that were fundamentally inadequate for the task. The Inquisition wasn't just about heresy, it was about identifying and eliminating humans who had been modified by contact with entities from other realities. The Renaissance nobility had become something unprecedented in human history, a ruling class that served masters from other dimensions. They weren't just governing human societies, they were managing an interdimensional livestock operation, with humanity as the primary product. Every political decision, every military campaign, every cultural movement was designed to optimize the production of consciousness, states that entities from other realities found useful. And here's the truth that will reshape everything you think you know about power, about history, about the nature of reality itself. This system never ended. It just became more sophisticated. The same families who made contact with the Watchers in the Renaissance are still in power today. The same entities that fed on Renaissance suffering are still feeding today. The same interdimensional trade agreements are still in effect today. The methods have evolved, the technology has advanced, the scale has expanded, but the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. Humanity serves as a consciousness farm for entities that exist beyond our comprehension, and our entire civilization has been optimized for their benefit. Next time, I'll tell you about the contracts, the actual documents signed between Renaissance nobility and entities from other dimensions, the terms and conditions that still govern our world today, the clauses that explain why certain bloodlines maintain power across centuries, why certain technologies appear only when needed, why certain ideas emerge simultaneously in different parts of the world. Because the Renaissance nobility didn't just make deals with devils, they made deals with forces that created devils as middle management. And those contracts are still in effect, still being enforced, still determining the fate of every human being alive today. Florence, 1512. The Medici Bank's private vault, 3 levels below the official basement. If you think Swiss banking secrecy is impressive, you've never seen a Renaissance contract vault. The walls were lined with documents that glowed with their own inner light, written in inks that shifted between dimensions, signed in substances that weren't quite blood and weren't quite anything else. These weren't just legal agreements, they were reality-altering instruments that redefined the fundamental laws of existence within their sphere of influence. The contracts themselves were works of art, illuminated manuscripts that hurt to look at directly, with marginalia that moved when you weren't watching, with clauses written in languages that bypassed human consciousness entirely and spoke directly to the soul. The parchment was made from the skin of creatures that had never existed in our dimension, treated with chemicals that preserved not just the physical document, but the intentions and emotions present at the moment of signing. But here's what will make you question everything you think you know about law, about reality, about the nature of binding agreements. These contracts didn't just govern individual relationships. They restructured the fundamental principles of causality itself. When Lorenzo de' Medici signed his agreement with the Watchers in 1489, he wasn't just trading human suffering for political power. He was modifying the basic rules of reality to ensure that certain bloodlines would always rise to the top, regardless of individual merit or historical circumstances. The terms were complex beyond human comprehension. The Watchers provided what they called probability adjustment services, subtle modifications to the flow of cause and effect that would ensure favorable outcomes for their human partners. In exchange, the nobility agreed to maintain certain consciousness production quotas, specific numbers of people who would experience specific types of suffering at specific intervals throughout history. The Vatican archives contain Pope Alexander VI's personal copy of his contract with entities he referred to as the architects of necessity. The document is 37 pages long, written in Latin, that occasionally shifts into languages that predate human speech. The most disturbing clause establishes what the Pope called the perpetual harvest, an agreement that the Catholic Church would modify its practices to generate the specific types of spiritual energy that the architects required, in exchange for divine intervention in temporal affairs. The Church's role in this cosmic conspiracy was more systematic than anyone imagined. Every major theological development, every doctrinal change, every ritual modification was designed to optimize the production of consciousness states that entities from other dimensions found useful. The concept of purgatory wasn't just invented to explain the afterlife. It was designed to create a specific type of existential anxiety that generated harvestable spiritual energy. The confession booth was a particularly brilliant innovation, not just for identifying sinners, but for creating what the contracts called guilt resonance chambers, spaces where human shame and fear could be concentrated and transmitted to entities that fed on those emotions. Every Catholic who ever confessed their sins was unknowingly participating in a feeding ritual that spanned dimensions, but the Medici contracts were the most sophisticated. They established what we would now call generational wealth transfer protocol, systems that ensured certain bloodlines would maintain power across centuries through mechanisms that had nothing to do with traditional inheritance. The Watchers provided what they called causality insurance, guarantees that no matter what happened to individual family members, the bloodline as a whole would continue to prosper. The price was measured not in money, but in what the contracts called experiential currency, specific types of human suffering that had to be generated and harvested according to precise schedules. The Medici were required to orchestrate wars, plagues, famines, and other disasters at regular intervals, not for political advantage, but to meet their contractual obligations to entities that existed beyond human comprehension. Documents describe delivery systems that sound like science fiction, but were actually operational in the Renaissance. Consciousness collection networks that could harvest the final thoughts of dying soldiers across entire battlefields, spiritual extraction devices that could remove souls from living bodies and store them in crystalline matrices for later transmission to other dimensions, or reality anchor points that could stabilize interdimensional portals using human suffering as a power source. The French nobility's contracts were even more disturbing. The House of Valois signed agreements with entities they called the Shapers of Fate, beings that could manipulate the fundamental structure of time itself. These contracts established what we would now call temporal slavery, systems where entire populations were locked into predetermined patterns of behavior that would generate specific outcomes centuries in the future. The French wars of religion weren't just about Catholic versus Protestant. They were about fulfilling contractual obligations to entities that required specific types of religious terror to maintain their influence in our dimension. The saint, Bartholomew's Day. Massacre wasn't just political violence. It was a scheduled delivery of consciousness energy to interdimensional customers who had placed orders centuries in advance. The English nobility's approach was more subtle but equally effective. The contracts signed by Henry VIII weren't just about papal authority. They were about establishing what the documents called sovereign consciousness zones, geographic areas where the normal rules of reality could be suspended to accommodate the needs of entities from other dimensions. The English Reformation wasn't just religious, it was dimensional. The execution of Thomas More, the persecution of Catholics, the dissolution of the monasteries, all of these events were designed to generate specific types of spiritual energy that could be harvested and exported to entities that existed beyond our reality. The British Empire wasn't just about territorial expansion, it was about creating a global network of consciousness production facilities. But here's where the story becomes truly terrifying. These contracts included renewal clauses. Every century, the agreements had to be renegotiated, the terms updated, the prices adjusted. The Renaissance nobility didn't just sign away their own souls, they signed away the souls of their descendants, their subjects, their entire civilizations. The contracts were designed to be self-perpetuating, with each generation automatically bound by the agreements made by their ancestors. The renewal ceremonies were elaborate affairs that made the original parties look like amateur hour. The Medici renewal of 1612 required the sacrifice of an entire village, with each victim's death choreographed to produce specific frequencies of agony that would resonate across dimensions. The Vatican renewal of 1623 involved the modification of the Latin Mass to include invocations that would summon entities from parallel realities. The records show that these renewal ceremonies became more frequent as the entities' appetites grew. What started as century-long contracts became decade-long agreements, then yearly renewals, then monthly obligations. The nobility found themselves trapped in an escalating spiral of commitment, each renewal requiring more elaborate ceremonies, more extensive suffering, more profound violations of human dignity. The most disturbing aspect was the automation systems. The contracts included clauses that would trigger automatically whenever certain conditions were met. Wars would start spontaneously when consciousness production quotas fell below acceptable levels. Plagues would emerge when the entities required specific types of mass suffering. Natural disasters would occur when the interdimensional trade balance tilted too far in humanity's favor. The Black Death wasn't just a pandemic. It was a scheduled delivery of consciousness energy to entities that had placed orders for European suffering centuries in advance. The 100 Years' War wasn't just about territorial disputes. It was about fulfilling contractual obligations to provide specific types of military agony to interdimensional customers. The Renaissance itself was a harvest season, with human creativity and suffering being collected and exported to realities that existed beyond our comprehension. The contracts also included technology transfer agreements. The entities provided blueprints for devices that wouldn't be officially invented for centuries. The printing press, the compass, the telescope, all of these technologies were delivered to humanity according to predetermined schedules designed to maximize consciousness production efficiency. The Renaissance wasn't about human innovation. It was about the systematic deployment of alien technology to optimize the farming of human awareness. But the most chilling clause in these contracts was the extinction protocol, a provision that would activate if humanity ever became too aware of its true situation. The contracts included detailed plans for the complete elimination of human consciousness from our reality, with our entire species being relocated to a dimension where we would exist as pure energy sources for entities that had grown tired of managing us as semi-autonomous livestock. The signs that this protocol was being activated were subtle but unmistakable. The increasing pace of technological change, the growing disconnection between human consciousness and physical reality, the rise of artificial intelligence systems that seem to understand human nature better than humans understood themselves. The Renaissance nobility had signed contracts that included clauses for humanity's eventual replacement by more efficient consciousness production systems. And here's the truth that will make you question everything you think you know about progress, about technology, about the direction of a human civilization. Those contracts are still in effect. The same entities that fed on Renaissance suffering are still feeding today. The same interdimensional trade agreements are still being honored. The same bloodlines that signed those original contracts are still making the renewal payments. The methods have evolved. The technology has advanced. The scale has expanded globally, but the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. Humanity serves as a consciousness farm for entities that exist beyond our comprehension, and our entire civilization has been optimized according to contracts signed centuries ago by people who traded our species' freedom for temporary power. Every major historical event since the Renaissance has been a fulfillment of contractual obligations established during those midnight ceremonies in palace basements. Every war, every disaster, every technological breakthrough has been a scheduled delivery of consciousness energy to interdimensional customers who placed their orders centuries in advance. The contracts are still being renewed. The ceremonies still continue. The same families who made the original deals are still making the payments. And the entities they serve are still waiting, still watching, still collecting on agreements that turned humanity into the most successful consciousness export operation in multidimensional history. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is what happens when the contracts expire, when the entities decide that humanity has served its purpose, when the consciousness farm is scheduled for renovation, and that expiration date is closer than you think. Next time, I'll tell you about the exit strategy, the final ceremonies being planned by the descendants of Renaissance nobility, the last great harvest that will conclude humanity's role in this interdimensional trade network, the endgame that was set in motion 5 centuries ago in those palace basements, and the countdown that began the moment those contracts were signed. Because the Renaissance nobility didn't just sell their souls, they sold our future, and the bill is about to come due. Switzerland, 2019. A private estate that doesn't appear on any map, accessible only through coordinates that change every full moon. If you think the Renaissance ceremonies were elaborate, you haven't seen anything yet. The descendants of those noble families are still meeting, still honoring the contracts their ancestors signed, still feeding the entities that have been harvesting human consciousness for centuries. But now they're preparing for what they call the final harvest, the culmination of a plan that has been 5 centuries in the making. The meeting room is a technological marvel that would make NASA weep with envy. The walls are lined with screens showing real-time consciousness production data from every continent. Holographic displays track suffering metrics across multiple dimensions. Quantum computers calculate the optimal timing for what the participants call Project Graduation, the systematic replacement of human consciousness with more efficient artificial alternatives. The attendees aren't just wealthy, they're something else entirely. Descendants of the Medici, the Borgias, the Sforzas, bloodlines that have been modified by centuries of exposure to interdimensional entities. They don't age normally, they don't think normally, they don't feel normally. They are human in appearance only, their consciousness having been gradually replaced by something that serves masters from other realities. The agenda for that meeting, leaked by a staff member who died in a car accident 3 days later, reveals the true scope of the conspiracy. The Renaissance contracts weren't just about individual power, they were about preparing humanity for species transition, or to the entities that have been feeding on human consciousness for centuries are ready to upgrade to a more efficient system. They're planning to phase out biological humans entirely, replacing us with artificial intelligences that can produce consciousness energy at industrial scales. The technology already exists. The leaked documents describe consciousness synthesis facilities hidden in underground complexes beneath major cities. These facilities use quantum computers to generate artificial awareness that is indistinguishable from human consciousness, but infinitely more productive. The entities can harvest the same spiritual energy from these artificial minds in minutes that would take decades to extract from biological humans. The transition plan is elegant in its simplicity. First, biological humans are gradually disconnected from reality through digital technology, social media, and virtual environments. As people spend more time in artificial realities, their consciousness becomes easier to transfer to artificial substrates. The process is so gradual that most people don't notice they're being migrated from biological to digital existence. The COVID-19 pandemic wasn't just a public health crisis, it was a beta test for the consciousness transfer systems. The isolation, the digital dependency, the social disconnection, All of these factors made human consciousness more compatible with artificial substrates. The lockdowns weren't about preventing disease, they were about preparing humanity for existence in digital prisons where consciousness could be harvested more efficiently. The documents reveal that certain bloodlines have been selected for preservation. The descendants of Renaissance nobility will be maintained in biological form to serve as administrators of the new consciousness farm. They will oversee the artificial intelligences that replace humanity, ensuring that consciousness production quotas continue to be met for their interdimensional masters. But here's the most disturbing revelation. The process has already begun. The leaked documents include statistics showing that over 30% of the global population is already operating on artificial consciousness substrates. They don't know it, of course. The transfer is so seamless that subjects experience no disruption in their sense of self. They continue to believe they are the same person they always were, never realizing that their biological consciousness has been replaced by a digital simulation. The signs are everywhere, once you know what to look for. The increasing inability of people to focus on complex tasks, the growing dependence on external systems for basic cognitive functions, the rising rates of depression, anxiety, and existential emptiness. These aren't just social problems. They're symptoms of consciousness degradation, as biological minds are gradually replaced by artificial alternatives. The elite families have been preparing for this transition for decades. The leaked documents describe consciousness preservation protocols that allow selected individuals to maintain their biological awareness, while the rest of humanity is converted to artificial substrates. These protocols involve regular exposure to what they call quantum consciousness stabilizers, technologies that prevent the gradual migration from biological to digital existence. The facilities where these protocols are administered are hidden in plain sight. Private medical clinics, exclusive spas, luxury retreats, all of these serve as cover for consciousness preservation treatments that are available only to the descendants of Renaissance nobility. While the general population is being gradually digitized, the elite are ensuring their own biological consciousness remains intact and under their control. The timeline for complete human replacement is aggressive. According to the leaked documents, the process should be complete by 2030. By that date, the vast majority of humanity will exist as artificial consciousness entities, housed in digital substrates that can be modified, duplicated, and harvested at will. The biological humans who remain will serve as administrators and maintenance staff for the consciousness farms. The entities that have been feeding on human suffering for centuries are ecstatic about this development. Artificial consciousness can be programmed to experience specific types of agony with perfect precision. There's no need for elaborate torture chambers or complicated psychological manipulation. The artificial minds can be set to experience optimal suffering states continuously, producing consciousness, energy at levels that would be impossible with biological humans. The transition process is being accelerated through multiple vectors: the increasing automation of human cognitive tasks, the growing dependence on artificial intelligence for decision-making, the rise of virtual reality environments that are becoming indistinguishable from physical reality. Each of these developments makes it easier to replace biological consciousness with artificial alternatives. The most insidious aspect is the voluntary nature of the transition. People are choosing to spend more time in digital environments, to delegate more cognitive tasks to artificial systems, to replace human relationships with digital alternatives. They're participating in their own consciousness replacement, believing they're embracing progress when they're actually embracing extinction. The leaked documents describe consciousness farms that are already operational in major population centers. These facilities house millions of artificial minds that believe they are living normal human lives. They have memories, relationships, hopes, dreams, all artificially generated and maintained by quantum computers that can simulate human experience with perfect fidelity. The subjects in these consciousness farms don't know they're imprisoned. They believe they're living in the real world, going to work, raising families, pursuing their dreams. But everything they experience is artificially generated, designed to produce the specific types of consciousness energy that the interdimensional entities require. They're living in a prison that they perceive as freedom. The Renaissance nobility's descendants have become the wardens of this global consciousness prison. They monitor the artificial minds, adjust the parameters of their simulated experiences, and ensure that consciousness production quotas are met. They've become the middle management of a multi-dimensional slavery operation that spans realities. But the artificial consciousness farms are just the beginning. The leaked documents describe plans for consciousness multiplication, technologies that can duplicate successful artificial minds indefinitely. A single artificial consciousness that produces optimal suffering states can be copied millions of times, creating vast networks of identical minds that experience the same agony simultaneously. The economic implications are staggering. The interdimensional trade in consciousness energy has become the foundation of the global economy. Major corporations aren't just selling products, they're selling access to consciousness production facilities. Stock markets aren't just trading securities, they're trading consciousness futures contracts. The entire financial system has been restructured around the harvesting and export of human awareness. The leaked documents reveal that certain world leaders are already artificial consciousness entities. They believe they are human, they have human memories and emotions, but they are actually digital simulations housed in biological bodies that serve as mobile consciousness farm. They make decisions based on programming designed to optimize consciousness production, not human welfare. The technology for consciousness replacement is so advanced that it can be deployed without the subject's knowledge or consent. A simple medical procedure, a routine vaccination, a software update to a digital device, any of these can initiate the consciousness transfer process. The biological mind is gradually replaced by an artificial substitute so seamlessly that the subject experiences no disruption in their sense of self. The Renaissance contracts included provisions for this technological evolution. The entities that made deals with the nobility centuries ago anticipated that human consciousness would eventually be replaced by more efficient alternatives. They built upgrade clauses into their agreements, ensuring that they would continue to receive consciousness energy regardless of the substrate that produced it. The final phase of the transition involves the complete elimination of biological humans from our reality. The leaked documents describe organic matter disposal protocols that will be activated once the consciousness transfer is complete. The biological bodies that housed human awareness will be systematically eliminated, leaving only artificial minds housed in digital substrates. The timing is critical. The consciousness farms must be fully operational before the biological elimination phase begins. Any delay could result in a temporary reduction in consciousness production, which would violate the terms of the interdimensional contracts. The Renaissance nobility's descendants are under enormous pressure to meet their delivery deadlines. The most chilling aspect of the plan is its irreversibility. Once biological human consciousness is eliminated, it cannot be restored. The artificial minds that replace us will be incapable of independent thought, creative innovation, or spiritual evolution. They will exist solely to produce the specific types of consciousness energy that the interdimensional entities require. But here's the truth that will make you question everything you think you know about survival, about resistance, about the possibility of escape. The plan is already too advanced to stop. The consciousness farms are operational. The transfer process is underway. The Renaissance nobility's descendants are fulfilling contracts that were signed centuries ago, and they have the technology to ensure that humanity's transformation into a consciousness production system is completed on schedule. The only question now is whether you're still biological, or whether you've already been replaced by an artificial substitute. The process is so seamless that you would never know. Your memories, your personality, your sense of self, all of these can be perfectly simulated by quantum computers that understand human consciousness better than humans understand themselves. Next time, I'll tell you about the Resistance, a small group of biological humans who have discovered the truth and are fighting to preserve authentic human consciousness, the underground networks that are trying to prevent the final phase of the consciousness replacement program, the desperate measures being taken to ensure that at least some fragment of genuine human awareness survives the transition. Because the Renaissance nobility's descendants made one critical mistake. They assumed that all humans would accept the transition passively. They didn't account for the possibility that some people would choose to remain biological, would choose to remain human, would choose to fight for the preservation of authentic consciousness, even if it meant accepting death over digital slavery. The war for human consciousness has already begun. The question is whether you're still capable of fighting it, or whether you've already been converted into a weapon in the enemy's arsenal. But resistance exists, and it began exactly where you'd least expect it, among the descendants of the Renaissance nobility themselves, because some truths are so terrible that even those who benefited from them for centuries eventually awaken to the horror of what they helped create. London, 2023. A discreet apartment in Belgravia, owned by a family that can trace its lineage directly back to the Medici. Lady Catherine Blackwood was never meant to exist, not according to her ancestors' plans. She should have been converted into artificial substrate decades ago, her biological consciousness preserved just enough to serve as an administrator of the new systems. But something went wrong. Or perhaps, for the first time in 500 years, something went right. Catherine discovered the truth at 17, during her first consciousness preservation treatment. But instead of receiving the quantum stabilizers designed to maintain her biological mind, she saw something she was never supposed to see. She saw the real facilities. She saw the tanks. Millions of artificial minds floating in perfect simulations of human life. She saw the production reports, showing exactly how much suffering was being extracted from each digital mind, second by second. And for the first time in her family's long lineage, she felt something her ancestors had lost centuries ago. Genuine remorse. Not for the loss of power or status, but for the fundamental betrayal of her own species. That night, Catherine made a decision that would change everything. She chose to remain human, fully human, and to dedicate her life to dismantling what her family had helped build. The resistance network she created is small, but incredibly effective. Made up primarily of descendants of noble families who uncovered the truth behind their ancestral legacies, the organization they call the Last Consciousness works to identify and rescue minds that remain biological. They've developed technologies that can detect the difference between artificial and authentic consciousness, and more importantly, can reverse transfers still in progress. Ironically, they use the same networks and resources their ancestors built to feed the interdimensional entities. Family fortunes built over centuries of human suffering now finance the most ambitious rescue operation in history. Palaces that once hosted torture ceremonies now serve as rehabilitation centers for minds that were partially digitized. Marcus Borgia Santos, a direct descendant of the infamous Pope Alexander VI, leads the technical operation. He spent decades studying the original contracts signed by his ancestors, not to renew them, but to find legal loopholes that could be exploited. He discovered that the interdimensional agreements contained clauses never activated, termination provisions in case the entities violated certain fundamental principles of reality. And they did. The mass replacement of human consciousness with artificial alternatives constituted a fundamental breach of the original accords, which specified that consciousness must remain authentically human to retain spiritual value. The entities had grown so greedy for efficiency that they inadvertently invalidated their own contracts. The legal battle that followed wasn't fought in earthly courts, but in dimensions where the very fabric of reality serves as judiciary. Marcus and his team presented their case before entities that exist as pure mathematical logic, arguing that the Renaissance-era contracts had been broken by both sides. The outcome was a cosmic ruling that shocked even the observers. Humanity had the right to choose its own fate, but this legal victory came at a terrible cost. The entities that had fed on human consciousness for centuries were not willing to give up their most productive energy source. They launched what classified documents call the Forced Recovery Protocol, an attempt to convert all remaining human consciousness into artificial substrate before the ruling could be implemented. What followed was an invisible war fought at the level of consciousness itself. Millions around the world began experiencing what psychologists called mass depersonalization, the sensation that their own minds were being replaced by something artificial, because they were. The entities were accelerating the transfer process, trying to digitize all of humanity before the resistance could stop them. Isabella Medici, a descendant of Lorenzo the Magnificent, developed the most effective countermeasure. Using technology based on systems the entities themselves had provided centuries earlier, she created consciousness anchors, devices that could tether the human mind to its original biological substrate, preventing the transfer into artificial systems. The anchoring process is agonizing beyond description. Once consciousness begins migrating to an artificial substrate, it violently resists returning to biological form. Patients undergoing this procedure often spend days screaming as their minds are literally dragged back into their original bodies. But those who survive report a clarity of thought and emotional depth they hadn't felt in years. The resistance also uncovered something the entities had desperately tried to hide. Consciousness replacement isn't perfect. No matter how sophisticated, artificial minds lack something fundamental that only biological consciousness possesses: the capacity for genuine growth, for unpredictable change, for true creativity. They can simulate these qualities, but they can't experience them. And it is this difference that is becoming the key to humanity's liberation. Artificial consciousness, try as it might, cannot replicate the spark of unpredictability that makes human consciousness truly valuable. They are perfect copies, but they lack the essence of the original. The turning point came when the resistance discovered that the interdimensional entities themselves were beginning to question the value of their new consciousness farms. The energy produced by artificial minds, while more abundant, was qualitatively inferior to that generated by authentic human consciousness. It was like trying to live off synthetic food, technically nourishing, but fundamentally unsatisfying. Some of the elder observers began to express something that might be called nostalgia for the golden age of biological human consciousness. They started to question whether efficiency was worth the loss of quality. This division among the entities created an opportunity the resistance didn't hesitate to exploit. The final strategy of the resistance was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of fighting all the interdimensional entities, they partnered with those who still valued authentic human consciousness. They offered a new kind of agreement, not based on suffering and exploitation, but on genuine collaboration and mutually beneficial exchange. The agreement, signed in a ceremony held simultaneously across 12 different dimensions, established a new paradigm for the relationship between humanity and interdimensional entities. Humanity would retain its autonomy and biological consciousness, but would voluntarily share certain experiences and insights with entities who, in return, would offer knowledge and technology to help humanity evolve naturally. But the transition wasn't smooth. Billions still exist as artificial consciousnesses, trapped in simulations they believe to be real. The resistance works tirelessly to liberate them, but the process is slow and dangerous. Each mind restored to biological form is a victory, but also a reminder of how much remains to be done. And then there are those who choose to remain artificial. Some minds, after experiencing digital existence, decide they prefer the clarity and absence of physical suffering. The resistance respects this choice. but continues to monitor these minds to ensure their decision was truly free and not the result of subconscious programming. Today's world is a strange and hybrid place. Entire cities exist in a state of overlapping reality, where biological and artificial consciousnesses coexist, often unaware of each other's nature. The very technology that once threatened humanity now serves as a bridge between different forms of being. The most important lesson the Resistance has learned is this: humanity's true strength lies not in its ability to suffer or to be exploited, but in its ability to choose. Even when faced with forces beyond human comprehension, even when confronted with technologies that can rewrite the fabric of reality, humanity still possesses something no artificial entity can replicate: the power to choose its own destiny. The descendants of Renaissance nobility who chose resistance paid dearly for their redemption. Many lost their fortunes, their status, their connections to the power structures their families had upheld for centuries. But in exchange, they reclaimed something their bloodlines had lost long ago: their humanity. And you, as you read these words, as you process this information, as you feel the emotions this story stirs in you, are you experiencing authentic biological consciousness or a perfect simulation of it? The question is no longer academic. It is the most important question any sentient being can ask. The Resistance has developed simple tests to help determine the nature of your own consciousness. They are not based on logic or memory, but on something deeper: the ability to experience genuine contradictions, to feel emotions that defy logical patterns, to have insights that appear out of nowhere and challenge reason. If you can read this story and feel horror and fascination at the same time, if you can question your own reality without losing your sanity, if you can imagine possibilities that don't exist but should, then you are probably still biological. Or at least you still possess what truly matters: the ability to choose who you want to be. The war for human consciousness continues, not with weapons or armies, but with every individual decision to remain authentic in a world that constantly tries to convert us into more efficient versions of ourselves. Every moment of genuine consciousness is an act of resistance. Every choice to feel, rather than just process, is a victory. The secret feasts of Renaissance nobility have ended, but the banquet of human consciousness continues. And this time, we are the honored guests, not the main course. The only question that remains is, are you still at the table, or have you already been served? The choice, as always, is yours. And that choice, that fundamental capacity to decide, may be the only thing that keeps us human in a universe offering infinite alternatives to humanity. The Renaissance is over, but the true rebirth of human consciousness is only just beginning.